On July 1st, 1863, the Dutch government abolished slavery in its colonies, Suriname and the Antilles. It was one of the last European countries to do so. Why was this? In this video you're going to learn about the Dutch road to the abolition of slavery. The Dutch government abolished slavery in its colonies on the 1st of July 1863. This was relatively late compared to other European countries. Spain did so in 1811, Great Britain in 1834, France in 1848. So why were the Dutch so late? So first off, how did the Dutch slave trade work? It started with a Dutch ship that sailed from one of the harbors of the Netherlands, from Vlissingen or from Amsterdam. The ship was packed with goods intended for West African merchants, because that's where the ship was heading to. For example, to the castle of Elmina, now located in present-day Ghana. There the Dutch traded their goods for African slaves that were captured by West African slave traders. The captured Africans were handed over to the Europeans, who put them on their ships. The journey from West Africa to the New World, or the Americas, took 6 weeks in favorable weather conditions, but it could last up to 4 months. Now, the Dutch slave traders, they tried to keep the slaves alive. I mean, a dead slave isn't worth much. However, abuse, torture did occur. Not to mention the outbreaks of diseases such as smallpox and dysentery. Now, most Dutch ships sailed to Suriname, which was a Dutch colony in the north of Latin America, or to one of the islands north of it, Curaçao or St. Eustatius. Did you know that during the 17th century, the Dutch held part of Brazil for a while, from 1630 to 1654. Once in the colonies, they were sold off. In Suriname, plantation owners had contracts with the Dutch West-Indische Compagnie, the WIC, for a certain amount of slaves against an agreed price. These contracted slaves were directly brought to the plantations. Now do notice that not all slaves worked on plantations. There were 3 types of slave workers: field slaves, 40%, artisan slaves, 15%, domestic slaves, 10%. The remaining 35 were children, the elderly, and disabled. Work in the field was by far the hardest work, but there were differences. The sugar plantations enjoyed a bad reputation, from working days lasting from 6 in the morning till 6 in the evening, sometimes even exceeding to 16 hours a day. The cotton plantations were the least bad a field slave could get, with working days not more than 8 hours a day. Conditions on the plantations varied. There were stories of plantation owners who tortured their slaves for the slightest offense. On the flip side, there are also stories of owners who had more humane policies, so to say. There was resistance against this all. In French Haiti, a revolution broke out where the slaves rebelled against their overlords, massacred the French, and established a new state. Inspired by these events on the Dutch island of Curaçao, Tula led a revolt against the Dutch overlords. This revolt was crushed, and Tula was executed on the breaking wheel. The Maroons in Suriname freed themselves from slavery and settled in the Surinamese interior. From there, they launched raids on the plantations to set other slaves free, or to loot and murder, or both. But what about the Dutch resistance against slave trade? Well, this existed in the form of abolitionism, a movement that strived for the abolition of slavery. But the abolitionist movement wasn't strong in the Netherlands. By 1800, the Dutch weren't the most enlightened people in Europe. The discussion was officially kick-started when the French who had taken over the country by that time, established a National Assembly in Den Haag in 1797. By that time, the Dutch overseas colonies had been captured by the British, and even the British hadn't abolished slave trade by this point, only the Danes. So why the hurry, was the idea. It was only after the defeat of Napoleon and the return of Wilhelm I that slavery was to be abolished. And this is ironic. Slavery wasn't abolished during the revolutionary times, but during the conservative era that followed it. A new Kingdom of the Netherlands was proclaimed. Willem I was pressured by the British to abolish the slave trade. The British had by now abolished the slave trade in 1808. Especially because they threatened not to return the former Dutch colonies to the Netherlands. The British then took the lead against the illegal slave trade, and while the French, Spaniards and Portuguese continued with the illegal shipping, barely any Dutch merchants tried to illegally ship off African slaves. Now, some of these illegal foreign ships did end up in Suriname. Measures against this were effectively carried out after 1826, when a registration system was introduced. The only Dutch ships that were intercepted were ships who had Dutch papers but were Dutch nor had a Dutch crew. And so, after centuries, the Dutch slave trade ended without much of a fuss. However, this did not equal the end of slavery. How did that come to an end? Because only in 1863 the Dutch abolished slavery. And why was this? See, in Britain during the 19th century, a middle class had developed itself, and they wanted to resist against the elite. They advocated against slavery. But the thing was that in the Netherlands, such a middle class hadn't developed yet. Dutch historian Piet Emmer wrote the following about it. That English enthusiasm prevented illegal slave trade in the English colonies because public opinion and officials were convinced that they were fighting for a good cause. Ship owners, investors, and planters who disagreed with this view had better remain silent. This was not the case in the Netherlands. In our country, the slave trade came to a standstill because Dutch shipping companies no longer saw any profit in it. There was hardly any belief in a good cause. In the Netherlands, this was usually dismissed as typical English hypocrisy with a philanthropic veneer. When the British abolished slavery in 1834, there was fear among Suriname's plantation owners that the slaves would run off to east of Suriname, where the British had their colony. But this turned out barely the case. Now, when the French abolished slavery in 1848, there was fear on St. Martin that the slaves would run off to the French part of the island. Now, this actually happened. So most Dutch plantation owners on St. Martin therefore set them free so they could continue to work on the plantations. So from that moment, slavery de facto ended in St. Martin. A slave revolt did occur on St. Eustatius. This was crushed with 12 deaths as a result. Now, when the French actually abolished slavery in 1848, the Dutch feared that slaves would run off to where the French had their colony. Therefore, the Dutch government pressured the plantation owners to treat their slaves better. So let's take a look at the political road to the abolition of Dutch slavery. Now in 1842, two different Dutch groups signed a petition which they handed over to the Dutch king, but he gave an evasive answer. 10 years later, public opinion was influenced by the American best-selling book Uncle Tom's Cabin. Also in the Netherlands, books that advocated against slavery began to appear, and by the 1850s it was clear that slavery was going to be abolished in the Dutch colonies. The question was when and how? Because it would take another 10 years to happen. The scare of 1848 had subsided and the worst abuses had come to an end. New laws were implemented concerning limitation of punishment, as well as improving nutrition, clothing and shelter. The Dutch government was concerned about two cases: compensating the slave owners and the future of the colony. What would happen if all the people that used to work on the plantations would be set free and leave the plantations? What also attributed to the fact was that from 1848 the Netherlands had become a parliamentary democracy. Legislation therefore proceeded much more slowly than when there was just one man, the Dutch king, in charge. And what had to become of the plantations? What if all the people that were set free, who previously worked as slaves on these plantations, would now leave the plantations? For that, the Dutch government obliged the slaves to continue their work on the plantations after slavery was abolished. In Suriname, this was for another 10 years. Also, each slave owner got 300 guilder of compensation for each slave he possessed. And the Dutch government was able to finance this because of the profits of the notorious cultivation system on Java in the Dutch East Indies. On the 1st of July 1863, a number of 32,911 Suriname slaves were now free people. This day of emancipation was celebrated in Paramaribo, the capital of Suriname. The festivities continued for 3 days and there were no noteworthy incidents. Thanks to my patrons, you see their names right now, and a special thanks to Thomas Zabiega, Damian Wallace, Connor, Philip Jordan, Marcus Kaas, Nick Terranova, Haley, Mark Littlehill, Janet Jojankiewicz, Joanne, Justin Tabell, Tanya Dixie, Henry Clarkson, Rob Park, Andrea Martic, Susanna Di Bella, John Beach, Fabrizio, Wayback History, Fernando Lopez Ojeda, Luis Pichera, and Mike West. What happened to the people that were now free? That deserves a video of its own. If you found this interesting, don't forget to like, also share this video with a friend. And if you want to know more about Dutch history, click right here. I want to thank you for watching en tot de volgende keer, maar weer.